Maureen with Sanditon Chronicles. Today we are doing episode 3, and I want to warn you this will be a spoiler episode as we are doing a recap of episode 1. So if you have not seen Sanditon yet, I encourage you to watch it first. We're going to go into pretty close detail of what happens on the show and some things that I think are going on behind the dialogue and behind what was scripted. So I would encourage you to watch Sanditon first. As many people as we can get to watch it on repeat, the better. But just know that this will be a bit of a spoiler episode if you haven't seen it yet. And if you have seen it, I would like your commentary on if you think I'm way off on some of these things or what you thought of episode 1. I think the first time I watched it, the beginning was a little hard for me to get into. Not because it wasn't interesting, but because I was just waiting. I was waiting for that Austen kick, that Austen love affair, the Austen love triangle. And I had known from the 1 or 2 preview episodes or trailers that I had seen that Sydney was going to be the love interest. I had not known about Stringer, so that was a nice surprise. But that comes in episode 2. So I wasn't instantly obsessed with it. I instantly liked it, but I was not instantly obsessed with it. The obsession came after Charlotte came into the town of Sanditon, and things really started to happen in there. But I do love how Andrew Davies is really good about when he writes an Austen adaptation, or really any adaptation he's done, or any script he's done, he's very good about laying a groundwork. And I think that although it's not the most interesting always, it's so necessary. You have to have the groundwork to understand exactly what's going to happen, where they came from, and where they're going. So I think he's really excellent at doing that. And I think the other writers joined with him in doing that aspect of this and letting us know this is where they came from and this is where they're going. I love the field where they were shooting rabbits, because you see that Charlotte's not afraid to get, and this was something that I believe, if my memory serves correctly, that Austen had kind of written that into her story. I don't know if it was in that detail or if she actually said they're hunting rabbits, but it gave a greater picture of Charlotte, that she was unafraid to get into the dirt. She was unafraid to lay in the ground and actually hunt with her brothers and sisters. That wasn't really a gentleman's daughter sort of thing to do back then. But that's who she was, and that was the type of personality she had, that she was unafraid to get dirty. She was unafraid to do the things that were unexpected, unafraid to do the things that she enjoyed just for the sake of society. So I think that was a really good character draw of putting that in there. So when we first joined Sanditon, I'm going to take a little sip of my coffee. You'll learn 2 things about me as we do this podcast. One is I love coffee. It doesn't matter what time of day it is. I love coffee. I picked this mug because it seemed very Sanditon-esque, very Austen-esque to me. The other thing is that because I'm a writer, when I was preparing for this episode, I was trying to take notes, and I took 3 pages of notes. And little tiny writing. I write very small. So it was 3 pages of notes that I had to condense so I didn't have you guys listening to me talk for 4 hours. So let's see how quickly we can get through it. So when we first see Sanditon, when we first introduced to it, we see Tom and Mary Parker first in their carriage. And you can see the dynamic difference between the two of them right off the bat, where even though it's clearly an uncomfortable ride for both of them, Tom is absolutely insistent, no, it's fine, it's good, it's fine, we're good. And Mary is clearly, are you insane? We're not good. We're not fine. This is a bad thing that's happening right now. So I did like that that's the first thing we see. That's our introduction to their characters. And it shows the juxtaposition of Tom when things are getting hard and things are getting bad throughout the series. He almost seems to get more manic. And right then, when it was a bad situation, he played off as, no, this isn't bad. It's good. It's fine. And that's kind of what he does through the whole series. So it gives you that glimpse. And that was taken from Austen. So they did a really good job carrying that through in his character throughout the entire series. The next thing we see is Charlotte, like we said, in the dirt, hunting rabbits. And she's unafraid to go up to these strangers. There's no lack of propriety there, but she's unafraid to approach these people she doesn't know, just because that's the right thing to do. And that's what Jane Austen's heroines are about, doing the right thing. Even if it costs something, even if it might look a little off, they do the right thing. And I think that they did a really good job with that. So Charlotte helps Tom and Mary into her house, offers her home to them. And one thing that should be cleared up, in our Facebook group, the Sanditon Chronicles, Sanditon Family Fan Club, we were discussing this. We had our rewind this past week, or the week before, rather, I'm sorry. The week before we had our Sanditon rewind, and we discussed different aspects from the different episodes. And this is one thing we discussed, at the time frame that they were there. They weren't just there for a couple of hours and sent on their way. In the book that Austen started, it was a fortnight, so it was 2 weeks that they were there. And in the show, I think they did try to display that it was more than a day. And you can kind of see that by the change of light, by the change of clothes, by the light to dark to light to dark. And I think that they tried to show you that it was multiple days rather than tell you. Because good storytelling, right, is not just telling the story. It's about having you live through it. It's about having you be there, and they did a good job with that. So it's important to note that it was a couple of days. So Tom is trying to convince them the greatness of his new venture, the greatness of this town that he's building up, and eventually they get that the dad doesn't want to come, but Charlotte is able to go. So Charlotte goes on this journey of a place that she's never been to before. I don't even think she's been away from Willingdon, really. And so she gets to this new place, this adventurously spirited girl who just wants the world, but not too much of it. She just wants something different. She wants something that makes her feel like she's contributing in some way other than your typical gentleman's daughter in the house, hunting rabbits, taking care of kids sort of way. She wants substance, a little more than what she's had. So we see her going into the town. We see her experiencing it for the first time. I love that shot when she first gets out of the carriage, and if I can put pictures in, I will put pictures in while I'm talking. I have to get approval for that first. But I love that scene where she first gets out of the carriage and she looks up into the town. It's a still shot where she's just staring kind of up like this, up into the town, with a smile on her face. Just the beauty of the work and the classes mixed together and all these contrasting things that work together into one cohesive thing. It sets the tone for different things, opposing things need to be together to work well. And that it sets the tone for the relationship that we're going to see throughout the series in multiple characters, not just Charlotte's relationships, but where it's opposites attract. Iron does sharpen iron, but there also has to be some differences there. And you see that in how she views the town when she first comes in there. So we see that. We see Lady Denham almost right off the bat being introduced. Of course, Tom wants to see her right away before his own kids because he's consumed with the idea of this town. Mary rightly convinces him to do something different and go see his children first. But then we meet Lady D, and she is this... I love her character, so I'm trying to find a way to say this that conveys my love for her, but also shows how inappropriate she can be. She just has this desire to run everything. And it's probably, we see in a later episode, it probably has a lot to do with the lack of control she's had in the beginning. She's actually quite a bit like Sydney, I would venture to say, in that aspect. So we see her come in, and we see her kind of harangue Tom, and it, what is the word I'm looking for? We see her kind of forcefully ask him why he did what he did, where he went, why he didn't get more out of that, when if he was going to leave at all, he should come back with substantial things. And we see her react to Charlotte for the first time. The other thing we see is Clara. We meet Clara, we meet her. She seems like this meek little church mouse sort of girl, and she's very polite. She says all the right things. She does all the right things. She's dressed the right way, but she is a prop to Lady D, essentially. And so we meet her. We see a relationship start or try to be started between her and Charlotte. And Charlotte wants that relationship because she's been in Willingdon for so long with a lot of responsibility as the oldest daughter. There would be a lot of responsibility on her in her large home of 12 children. There would be a lot of responsibility put on her as almost like a quasi-mother figure. So she yearns for friendship outside of her sister. She loves her family, she loves her siblings, but she yearns for that friendship. And so we see them meet, and then we meet Esther and Edward. Now, they are different sort of characters. And I have to say that I immediately love Esther. she may be one of my favorite characters. I don't know that I love any one of them more than another because I feel so connected and involved in these characters, but I love her. I love her personality. I love how she is unapologetically honest. But also there's some harshness to it where it's almost like a protection aspect, I would say. So we meet them, and then shortly after that we meet on the cliff walk, which also, again, in the carriage ride home, or back to Sanditon rather, not home, we see the seaside, we see the cliff tops. Tom points it out, he's in love with it, he's engrossed by it. And then we see a little bit more of that, of the beauty that is there, of the greenery of the cliffs and the vastness of the sea and the sand that it connects with that lands it all. We see them on that cliff walk, and that's where we meet Arthur and Diana, who also I absolutely love. I think Arthur actually him and Lord Babington might be my two favorite male leads. Just because Arthur is so unapologetically, and I know I've said that word already, but he's so unapologetically kind. And he's not concerned with what other people think of him. And maybe it's that he doesn't notice what other people think of him, but I think that in his presence, he ends up being so jovial that you can't help but be the same in his presence. Now, when we first meet him and Diana, we see a different side of Arthur than we do the rest of the series. We see him almost bothered when we first meet him. It's the first time you see him actually down. And I think that's the only time you see him down in the series, is when we first meet him and you see Diana as the exuberant, yay one. And that's also, well, she's always very exuberant. She's always very, I wouldn't say manic, but what is the word Dr. Fuchs used? Hysterical. She's always a little bit on the hysterical side, but it's not usually like joyous hysterical. It's fearful hysteria. So we meet them, they go back to Arthur and Diana's rented house. And after that, we are still waiting for the mysterious Sydney to appear, right? So we see they go to sea bathing, and that was a whole aspect that I think the thing is that people don't expect, because it's Jane Austen. They expect it to be very, very reserved always, and they expect it to be very, very clean and very good and while I don't let my kids watch Sanditon with me, I'll let them watch parts. The bathing scene is obviously not one, but we think that because we see a naked butt, that it was hard for me to say that, I don't know if you could tell that, but the nakedness, we think, oh, that's so vulgar. Jane Austen would never. But here's the thing. Jane Austen would have done that because it wasn't a vulgar thing. That was just a fact of how the men swam, of how they did things. Jane Austen wouldn't have watched it. She wouldn't have seen it. And maybe that's where we get the idea that it's vulgar when it's actually not. That's just truth and indicative of that time. That's how the men would have swam. Alternately, that's also how the women would have swam, which, can you imagine swimming in that? I can't. I don't know if any of you have ever done this, but when I graduated high school, I think it was high school, maybe it was something else, but we dove in a thing of water and we had all of our clothes on, pants and shirts and everything. It was so difficult to actually move around in that water. And back then, the women did have to wear bathing suits like that. They did have to wear like it was a dress almost. I mean, it was a robe, but it was a dress. So on top of that, they also had the free-flowing skirt that could get caught up in their legs that would prevent them from doing that. So it's just, that is a realistic aspect of what would have happened then. So we see them in the bathing for the first time. I love their reactions where it's very, very real. And it's very, very, with Clara especially, I loved her reaction. It was instant, like, exhilaration that she felt when she dove into the water. And I loved that. I could almost feel what it felt like to have the cold seawater on them. Although I wouldn't want to do that in February in Bristol. There's no way. But I used to live in the UP of Michigan, and we would dive into Lake Superior in September, which you would think not cold, but Lake Superior in September is bitingly cold. It's like a million needles all over you, and I wouldn't want to hang out in that water, especially not in February. So I think that their reactions really put you there, and it really had you go through the motions with them, and I really appreciated that aspect of it. After that, we go into, we see Esther. Roughly after that, we see Esther going into town with finding Mary and Charlotte on their walk and talking about, Mary asks Charlotte, would you still dance with the shopkeeper? Would you feel any shame? And that's when they run into Esther. Now, Mary also buys, here's one thing I'm unsure of, if Mary has actually bought Charlotte the pair of blue shoes or Charlotte bought them. I believe it's Mary who bought them, but that shows you a bit about Mary's character, that she saw something of this new friend. It was a new friend. It was the first day or two that she had been there, and she already found something she really wanted to purchase for this friend of hers. And then Charlotte goes on this walk with Esther, which is so telling of Esther's character, right from the way she walks until the things she says, right up until the point where she talks about the sea with Charlotte. I think it's such a beautiful and complete insight into Esther's character and who she is and why she is the way she is. I love that aspect of her. So her and Charlotte walk across the sea. They talk about the town. They talk about the Parkers. They talk about perceptions, which is a lot of what Jane Austen writes about, is the perception of things, right? If you look at Pride and Prejudice, it was Elizabeth's perception of Darcy and Darcy's perception of Elizabeth based off of Mrs. Bennet. And it's like that in Sense and Sensibility. It's like that in Persuasion and Mansfield Park. It's like that in all of her works. And it's really, really played out well here, I think. So after the walk with Esther, we meet Sydney for the first time. After Mary says, we need to go to Lady D's, right, for tea. We meet Sydney for the first time. And there's a certain air of mystery to him that I think Austen really wrote about well. And Austen, we have to remember, I said this in our intro video, but it's not a typical Austen work. The show isn't, because it's not all Austen, but her book is also not typical Austen. The times were changing. And on top of that, Austen was changing. She was in her 40s when she wrote this. She was at a time where things were different in her life than they had been previously. She was at a time where she was also feeling very sick and in a lot of pain. So writing these characters out of that into that midst, you see that there's a little bit of a darker underbelly to the characters. And so Sidney embodies that. The first moment you meet him, he embodies that completely. And we see his interaction with, a lot of people think it's pride, but I don't think it's pride when he calls Charlotte a maid. And we'll kind of dig into that a little bit. And then, so after that, we see them walk through the forest where Charlotte and Mary see Clara and Edward doing, or not Charlotte and Mary, just Charlotte sees Edward and Clara doing something they really shouldn't be doing. It's one of the scenes I don't fast forward, but it's because there's such short glimpses that I just look away. But we see that, we see Charlotte's, there is a confusion there, but there is a sense of understanding of what's happening. She doesn't really know what they're doing, but she knows that what they're doing is not okay. Part of the indication could be it's a male and female out in the woods, secluded by themselves. That is an indicator of wrongdoing. But it's also in the way that and this is one aspect where they did a really good job of non-verbally displaying what's happening, because Charlotte, she kind of watched them for a minute, but then you see that as their faces and their body reacts, she gets more uncomfortable. And this show is a lot of subtlety. This show is a lot of saying things without actually saying them in dialogue form. So that was one aspect where Charlotte was like, this is probably a bad thing. But you see that she didn't jump to a conclusion just because she had an idea it was wrong. And so when she meets up with Mary and they go back to Lady D's, they meet in her sitting room. Clara is very aware of what she was doing. Obviously, it was not okay. She was very aware. But even in that, it's almost like Charlotte felt sympathy for Clara. That Charlotte didn't fully understand. I'm convinced she didn't fully understand what was happening. Not because she was too dumb, and not because she was some naive little girl who had she was a little naive. She was in Willingdon for her entire life, and she hasn't been exposed to that aspect. But she felt sympathy for Clara because I think it was partly because Clara was caught out. And that's not a comfortable position for anybody to be in. And I think her desire was for Clara to feel some sort of companionship with her still. I think it was both for Clara, but also for Charlotte. Remember, we talked about how Charlotte really wanted this friendship. Clara obviously understood the wrongness of what was going on. And so she reacted accordingly. And I love the musical score in this, through the whole thing. I really, really do. I think they did a really good job intermingling that music, where it starts off as Clara playing into Charlotte getting ready, and then into the final dance scene. Now, in the dance scene, we can see Esther and Edward. They're the first thing you see when you're going into the ball. And I think that we can see that that's really the first time that Edward makes Esther truly uncomfortable. And I don't think it's all about that they're in public and he's doing these things that could potentially be very embarrassing and very harmful to their reputations. I think it is partly that, but I think it also has a lot to do with the fact that Esther doesn't just want a physical relationship with anybody. I think Esther really craves love, and she craves that loving relationship with Edward because she loves him and she wants to see that reciprocated. And I think that the things that he invokes in her, the feelings that he causes to rise up in her, confuse her quite a bit because she does just want that love. And I think that he makes her really uncomfortable in that scene by causing that. It's for him, it's seductive. For him, it's passionate. And I think for her, she certainly feels the stirrings of that. But I think she also is made to feel very uncomfortable by it. And I'm pulling that just from her expression at the end of that scene when he draws the card up her arm. Now, after that, we lead into the ballroom, where we meet Sidney and his friends, Lord Babington and Mr. Crow. And that is the first time that we see Crow and Babington, right? And of course, Babington is going to be placed with Esther. And if you don't know why yet, we'll leave that for another episode. But of course, he's going to be paired up with Esther. And that leaves Crow with Clara. And I think that, I think those are really well-matched characters because Crow, you see, even from his remark of we're assured of good sport here, and he's talking physicality, even in that, he's a match for Clara because Clara, that's what she knows. That's what she's comfortable with. That's been a part of her life for so long. And then there's, of course, Esther and Babington. And I think the beauty there is that Babington fancies himself sort of this ne'er-do-well in society, that he's a rascal. But deep down, Babington is really a kind-hearted person to Esther's steely persona, which I firmly believe is just a persona. That's a well-balanced pair. Which of course leaves Sidney and Charlotte. So they have their initial dance, and there's some things that they find out about each other through this initial dance. And then while they're dancing, the dance is interrupted. The music completely stops for the announcement of Miss Georgiana Lamb, who is the first black character that Jane Austen has written about. Of course, Jane Austen doesn't refer to her as a black character in her book, but she is a black character in the series. And so we see sort of the town's reaction to a black person in their midst, which is just completely shocking. And we're going to get into that a little bit later where we talk about the mutterings that you can hear. So she clearly does not like Sidney. Very, very clearly. Does not like him, does not appreciate him, she has some animosity towards him. We aren't really told what that is just yet until they dance together. Okay, so Edward then comes up to Charlotte to try to do some damage control, to try to exude his charm. I'm reminded of that movie Tangled. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie. But when Flynn Rider first meets Rapunzel, and he's trying to smolder at her to get what he wants, and then he says, she has no reaction to it whatsoever, and he says, "This is a very off day for me." That's the way Charlotte is with Edward. She doesn't subscribe to his charm. She doesn't subscribe to his effusions of sensuality. She doesn't subscribe to them. They, in fact, make her very uncomfortable. And she's very, from the moment that they're walking on the cliff tops, I think she's put on guard about him. I think she was flattered at first at his reaction when she first met him, but then the walks on the cliff made her really uncomfortable. And she heard the words he was saying, even though they could have been taken in an okay context. The words that he was saying, the way he was saying them, the tone he was saying them, certainly put her on her guard, and she did not really care for Edward. And I think that while they were dancing, how he tried to convince her even put her off even more. So they dance together. We see them separate, and then we see Georgiana and Sidney come together, and small little exchange. It's very small, it's very quick, but it's very, very telling. Sidney does seem put off by it, but I don't think he is. I think he's genuinely trying to the best of his abilities to find out how his ward feels about being in this new town, in this new area. And Georgiana holds no punches back. She clearly tells him, basically, screw you, you did something I didn't want to do, you pulled me from where I didn't want to go, you knew I didn't want to leave, and you did it anyway, so I'm not happy with you. After that dance, we see Charlotte and Clara talking about in the what happens in the field, or in the forest rather. Now, Clara is trying to do the exact same thing that Edward does, but Edward tries to he doesn't look too deeply at the person he's talking to. He just assumes that if he's charming and he's seductive, that he'll get what he wants out of a woman. Clara, if you pay attention to how she watches Charlotte from the very beginning, I think she's been trained to do that. She plays on Charlotte's sympathies. She plays on what she's realized and figured out about Clara. It's more, or about Charlotte. It's more than just, I need to make sure this doesn't get out. It's, I'm going to spin this in a way that you're going to receive me well, and in fact, go further than that and have sympathy for what I was forced to do out of the unwillingness that I had about it. So Crow comes up and interrupts that, and he pulls her off to the side, and you see Clara's feelings, or her effusions of her feelings, completely alter. Complete 180. And I think that's very telling of her character. I don't think she's lying necessarily, but I think it shows you what she's been trained to do. And we will see more of that as the series goes on. She lets more slip about her background, about her life before Sanditon, about her life before coming to Lady D's house. So after that, we see Charlotte going up into the balcony, and Sydney's there all by himself. And Charlotte goes there to escape. And I think that's where, when we talked about ironing, sharpening iron, that's what they have in common, is sometimes they need that quiet space to be away from the exuberance, to be away from the crowds. But there's also the differences, and Sydney's all gloom, and Charlotte is all joy. Even when she's telling him, he asks her, what are your opinions on this? She gives him her opinions freely, but they're said with almost a joyful thing about them, a joyful perception of the Parkers. She says it with, it's love, but it's almost laughingly. And so he does not receive that well, clearly. But it's because of their differences that her laughing about it is not a sign of lack of respect. It's not a sign of, I think that they're terrible. But that's how she receives things, is truth with a smile. There's that one line in Becoming Jane, the movie on Jane Austen, it's not fully true to form, but where the character who plays Jane Austen says, irony is truth with a smile. And I think that's what Charlotte is doing there. She's being honest and truthful, but the smile is there because she loves them already. It's not because she dislikes them. It's not because she disapproves. It's because she genuinely loves them in spite of their differences, in spite of the things they aren't doing right, in spite of their crazy. She still loves them. And I think that's what she was trying to convey. But all Sydney heard was an attack. And I think it's because he felt the same way, but he felt guilt about feeling that way. So Sydney, of course, unleashes on Charlotte of, how dare you? What are you thinking? And that ends the first episode, where our heroine and our main love interest are at odds. Again, true to Austen fashion. It's the typical, I love you, I like you, I'm interested in you, but then I'm going to find something at fault with you, and then I'm going to pull back. And so that's where we end episode 1. So now what I'd like to do is I just kind of want to get into the details of what is actually happening in this episode. And I think that there's a lot we can pull from it. On our opening meeting with Tom and Mary, we sense the relationship dynamic, the difference, right? We talked about that, how Mary is more of the, no, this is actually bad, and it's bad, so we're going to say it's bad. And Tom is more, well, this is bad, but if I pretend that it's actually good instead of bad, then it'll be good, right? So you see that kind of war there. And I think that the way Chris Marshall plays that character of Tom Parker, that war becomes a little more clear, that he's not just some buffoon. He's not a fool who is, good words alone will save the day. He's not actually that way. And we see that later on in the series as his character is more developed. But the other thing is that Tom begins humble. In that first episode, when he is at the Haywood's residence, and Charlotte says, and you're building all of this? And he says, yes. But then he corrects himself and says, well, I'm causing it to be built anyway. So he starts off very humble about what he's doing. He has pride in it, deep abiding pride, because it is his plans. They are his designs. This town is his town because he is causing it to be built. So there is a sense of pride there. But he still recognizes that other people are actually helping him out. He still recognizes that it's not all him alone. At least in the beginning he does. And I think that he actually does throughout the series, but I think that there are points when he feels he has to mask that. So Mr. Haywood, he never goes far from home. He says it, right? He makes a point of never going far from home. But then he pulls Charlotte aside and he says, be careful. And she says, of what? He says, everything. Now, part of me thinks, and this could be just me overanalyzing, but part of me wonders what kind of experience he had that would, one, cause him to stay home, and two, cause him to warn his daughter of, hey, just so you know, these seaside towns, these things happen here. Because I think that he would naturally warn his daughter. She's going up with strangers. She's going somewhere new for the first time. He would naturally warn his daughter. But I think that there's a deeper underlying thing that I really want to dig into. And I can create all these scenarios of what actually might have happened. But I think that's sort of something for the reader to figure out, is what actually happened in Mr. Haywood's youth before he met his wife, before he was married. Did he have an experience in a seaside town that was really not okay, that was not good? Let me know what you think about that aspect. Let me know. Send us an email and let us know if you think that that's something that happened, or if you just think he just doesn't like town. Also, Mary was longing for companionship. You can clearly see that. She was very excited to have the oldest daughter come. And I think as we go through that first episode, we see that she really doesn't have anybody. She has Lady D that she goes to, but that's more an obligation than anything else. I mean, I don't think Lady Denham has allowed herself in decades, probably, to be friendly enough to have friends. And I think that's part of the reason why she feels the need to control everything around her. So she's not truly a friend to Mary. Mary doesn't really have anybody in the town to connect with until Charlotte. And I think that Mary, she wants that companionship. She wants that friendship so badly. Because what woman doesn't? What woman doesn't want that? What person really, what human being doesn't crave that kind of connection with another person? Yes, she has a husband. Yes, she has her kids and they love each other, but that's familial. That's not friendship. That's not confiding in each other. That's not leaning on each other to advise and unbiasedly help. And I think that it's really telling how Charlotte, when they're in the carriage, how she looks at Mary versus how she looks at Tom. When Tom says, let's go right to Lady D's, I have business. And she says, before our own children? And the way Charlotte looks at Tom is almost incredulous, but the way she looks at Mary is very knowing. And it's very, not accepting, but approving of Mary's mindset. It's approving of how she's speaking to Tom. It's approving of her mindset. And I think that to me almost senses like, I kind of felt like the look she gave Mary was, this feels natural. This feels normal. So you kind of imagine that she has that in her own home, where her mom is the guiding force, right? The one who whispers in her husband's ear. And I think that put her right at ease. And I think that made her feel more comfortable, really. So when we get to the house, Tom talks about Sydney's portrait, right? That portrait actually was specially commissioned too for the show. And I think that I think it's a beautiful picture. I think it's well done. I think that I'm not an artist, but I enjoy the picture and I think it's beautiful. And I think that it's indicative of that time too, where it has aspects that look like Sydney, but it's just, there's parts that are just a little bit off, but I think that's how they would have done it back then. So I think that was a really good authentic point. But when Tom is talking about that portrait, and he's talking about Sydney, you get a sense that he almost has a responsibility, like he feels responsible for all Sydney's goodness, for all his accomplishments, that, oh, he's a man about business, he's this, and you'll see him, and you'll meet him, and he'll be great. And it's the same way he speaks, and I'm going to bring up episode 2 here. It's the same, he talks about Sydney in that moment the same way that he talks to James Stringer about his plans for the town when they're up on the scaffolding in episode 2, when he says, yes, that was my idea, was it not? He talks about Sydney in the same tone, in the same manner, when he's looking at the portrait of Charlotte. So I think he feels responsible for all the good things that Sydney has experienced, for all the good things Sydney has accomplished. It was Tom who got him out of that bad situation in Antigua. So it's also easy to forget that Charlotte is a gentleman's daughter, right? because she's going into Trafalgar House. That's a really hard word to say. She's going into Trafalgar House, where they have money, they have wealth, they have status. They aren't as wealthy as Lady D, but they are essentially, for all intents and purposes, they're the owners of the town. So they have a certain place in society that Charlotte, you wouldn't think she has, because she just seems very, very calm. She's from the country. She's not from town. But she is a gentleman's daughter. So she is of a higher rank than the workers who are in that town. She's technically out of their league, but she's just on the cusp, right in between being in the higher echelons of society to the workers' class, because her family does have 12 kids. So while she's a gentleman's daughter, she's not wealthy. I'm sure they do fine. Based off of what I've read into Jane Austen's first part of this novel and the depictions of the Haywoods at their home, they aren't suffering by any means. They aren't losing. But even Charlotte says, I've never had my own room before. So, well, she's a gentleman's daughter. She isn't as wealthy as the Parkers, but she's also not as far down as the workers. So it's easy to forget. It gets lost in translation that she's a gentleman's daughter. And right around then is when we see Lady D. Now, when we first meet Lady D, Lady Denham, she has a strong desire to control Tom's movements, but she has a strong desire to control everyone around her. I don't think it's solely that she thinks she's right in everything. I think it's a fear-based thing, but I also think that's the only way that people will be around her, is if she's controlling them. Otherwise, she has nobody. Her ward, Clara, comes to her, and she controls everything Clara does. In fact, I would say that Clara is kind of like a prop for Lady D. It's almost like she's an extension of Lady D's greatness, right? When you see her at Lady Denham's house in the sitting room, she says, Clara, play for us. And then she starts praising all these things Clara does. But in other episodes, you see where, while she praises Clara, it's never like, Clara is so good because she's Clara. It's, this is my ward, and she's good because she's my ward, sort of thing. And ward is the wrong word there, but you understand. So I think that for Lady Denham, the control thing has a lot to do with the fact that no one would be around her if she didn't control them in some way, if she didn't compel them with her wealth and her status to be near them. And that has to be a very lonely life to lead. And I think that's why she's so particular about every single aspect that Tom is going through. There's later episodes I have to keep stopping myself from talking about, but we're just on episode 1 today. So Tom also, in that moment, he reacts, his facial expression, it reacts to Lady Denham for the first time, but he doesn't say anything, right? But he's also not placating her. So that's the only time really that I can think of where in that episode where he actually reacts instead of placates. But we see that Mary is the one who's verbal. And I think with Mary, and we do see this confirmed throughout, the only times that Mary verbally stands up to Lady Denham is when it involves someone else. I think Mary is painted as this good, mild-mannered, sort of weak housewife thing. But she's not. When it comes to the protection of her friends, when it comes to defending people who have no defense, Mary is right there to defend them, to speak for them. Even when they meet Sydney on the cliffs, she defends Sydney to Charlotte. Charlotte didn't ask for that. Charlotte didn't say anything negative about him, but Mary immediately went into defensive for him. Not defensive, but defending him for making excuses for his bad behavior. And she does the same thing to Lady D when she starts to harass Charlotte about, of course your family sent you here for a husband. Of course your family sent you here for money. Mary says, Lady Denham, like, how dare you? You can't do this to a new acquaintance. And I think that that's also telling of Mary's reaction. And with Clara too, I mean, she is a prop to Lady Denham. But you have to imagine she's just been a prop her entire life. And with Charlotte, you can see she closely eyes Charlotte's conversations. And every moment. And it's not just Charlotte, it's everyone around her. Like when they were in Tom's sitting room. And Lady Denham actually says, go sit with Clara. So Charlotte goes to sit with Clara, and Clara asks her some basic questions. But then when Lady Denham pulls Charlotte's attention back to Lady Denham and asks her a question, starts talking to her, if you watch Clara, you can see her kind of eyeballing her out of the corner of her eye and watching her intently, watching her body movements, her facial expressions, and listening very closely to the words she says. When they're on the cliff tops, Edward and Esther are right behind her having a conversation, and you can kind of see that Clara turns to the side a little bit, leans back to hear their conversation. I think it was a safeguard that she used to ensure that she knew her enemies, that she understood the people around her, even if they weren't her enemies. I think it was something that she was trained to do. I think part of it is that everyone was competition for her. I think that everyone had the potential to take from her what she needed to survive, and I think everyone had the potential to take things that would have made her life less horrific. And so I think she was trained to do that. And on a similar but less dark vein, when we see Esther meet up with Charlotte and they walk out of town, the speed at which Esther is rushing out of town, I touched on this a little bit earlier, but it's almost like she's trying to escape the town, especially when you see how it is where it's the buildings are kind of coming in at an angle and you can see them going out beyond the work, beyond the build, and out into the sand, into where the sea is. And I think that it's almost like it was scripted to show how much Esther felt she needed to get out, and how much Esther felt trapped. And she felt, even when she's talking with Charlotte and she says, don't feel bad for Clara, she's basking in the warmth of Sanditon Place while we shiver and freeze in the damp and cold of Denham House. So she still feels like she needs to be somewhere else, that she's suffering where she's at. And she is a little bit, Esther is. And so when she's talking to Charlotte about the seas, when they finally get there, we see how Esther kind of views the sea as something that's trapping her in. It's suffocating. It's all so dreary. And she says to Charlotte that in time, I trust that you'll regret ever coming to Sanditon. I know I did. So it makes you wonder, what was it like before coming to Sanditon? We know that Esther's mom marries Edward's dad. So there's a lot of things that happened that were outside of Esther's control that she was forced to do and she didn't want to do. First, it was her mother marrying this man, so they had to move to Sanditon. Then it was Edward, the stepbrother, grooming her so that she believed she needed to live with him and no one else and couldn't be with anyone else because he's groomed her to believe that he is it, the be all end all. And after that, the money ran out and they physically couldn't leave to go anywhere because there was no money to go do it. So everything about that town just seemed to close in on Esther and make her feel almost claustrophobic, almost like she was dying a slow death. And so what she saw as something that was trapping, Charlotte saw as freeing. Charlotte saw as invigorating and exciting because she had never been anywhere else. She had never known anything else. So for her, the sea was the opposite. And I bring that up because Esther and Charlotte are actually very similar in terms of how they view things, how they see things, what they're able to understand. Now, of course, their demeanor is different. Esther's more harsh and more cold and more closed off than Charlotte is. Charlotte is open and happy and jovial. But we can see that what Esther tells her about the Parkers, Charlotte has come to the exact same conclusions about the Parkers, only with less harsh words. The only difference is Sydney. She doesn't come to that same conclusion about Sydney, and I think that's because, and we're going to discuss so let's back up a minute. When Sydney ran into them on the hilltops, he calls her new maid, but I don't think that was a prideful thing. I don't think it was him being cruel. It could have been a genuine assumption, sure, but I think it was more that he was detachedly getting info from this woman who immediately piqued his interest. And I think because of that, some of his guard was let down and he was able to give Charlotte a glimpse of who he was outside of what anybody else saw. And I think that's why she came to a different conclusion about Sydney than Esther did. And that was the only variation of that. But everything else Esther had said about the Parker family, Charlotte told Sydney in that balcony. So on that same note of Sydney finding that instant attraction to her, we know, first of all, that, of course, if you only watched the first episode or you haven't seen it all, you don't know this, but I'm going to tell you that Charlotte is completely different than Eliza Campion. And now we know in the first episode that Sydney has had bruising experiences, Mary calls it, with women, and that is with Eliza Campion, where she threw him over for a wealthier man. And So not only does Charlotte look different than Eliza Campion, Eliza is this beautiful, fair, blonde-haired woman who was meant to be a society wife, but she is also willing to do what it takes to get where she needs to go. Charlotte is the opposite of that. So Charlotte is the opposite of Eliza in every way. Personality, demeanor, ideals, and also appearances. So Sydney is piqued. His interest is piqued almost immediately upon seeing her. So I think the new maid comment is more of a genuine desire to know more and to get her to say her name. And I'm also getting that because during the interaction, Charlotte gets more looks from Sydney. Of course, Sydney knows who Mary is, but he still gives Charlotte more time with his looks, and he gives her one parting one before he leaves, before he actually says goodbye. And I think that Tom, while he expects a lot from Sydney, Sydney does usually deliver. But even Mary says about Sydney, you know that he's last minute with everything. Sydney Parker's last minute with everything. And we see in the first episode that Tom is freaking out the whole time because Sydney's not there yet. Sydney hasn't delivered yet. Sydney hasn't done this yet. So while he usually does deliver, Tom still kind of holds to this idea of who he was before, that he was reckless and in need of rescue. And the irony there is that now it's Tom who's reckless and in need of rescue. And I think part of him must hold on to that idea that Sydney needs rescue, because then he can still hold him to say, well, I'm rescuing you, so you got to keep rescuing me. And I don't think he does it consciously. I don't think he does it selfishly. I think he does it because he's in a really bad place. And if his town and his venture doesn't find success, if it doesn't get out of its financial hole, then they're in a very, very big problem. And so I think that this rescuing that Tom almost demands of Sydney from his previous help, I think Sydney's overwhelmed by the reliance and dependence that other people have on him. Now, the only people we really see who depend on him fully is Georgiana, because she has to, and Tom, because he wants to. So even those two, I think that Sydney's overwhelmed by that reliance on him. I think he's overwhelmed by the dependence that people have on him, because I don't think he thinks he's able to do what they need. And I think that a lot of his anger comes from his self-loathing that he has because he cannot fulfill the needs of the people who are there for him, who have helped him, who he has a debt to pay to. But I think it's also because he just does not like himself. I think that he does not like that he is afraid. I think he does not like that he struggles to connect with people, because the times he has connected with people, it's been trouble. And I think that I don't think he enjoys himself. I think he's got self-loathing from all the things he's done in his past and all the ways he has to continue to help people. And he doesn't think he has it in him to do what people need of him. And I think that's something that Charlotte relieved in him. She quieted his disquiet in there, and she forced him to look at truth, which was he is capable if he just tries. If he was willing to let down his guard, he's more than capable. And I think she brings that out in him, and I think that he responds to it so well because Charlotte doesn't expect anything from him. In fact, she's fighting with him most of the time. She doesn't expect him to do anything. She doesn't expect him to give anything to him. She just wants to join him in it. She wants to walk alongside him. And I think, honestly, that Tom sees that struggle in Sydney. And we can see that after their first interaction, the way Tom looks at him right after Sydney says, I know a great deal more about Georgiana than I want to. And paraphrase that. But Tom looks at him a certain way. And you can see that Tom understands that Sydney's struggling and probably knows a little bit about what he's struggling with, but he chooses to ignore it. Now, again, he doesn't choose that for a selfish reason. I think he does it because I think his head is always at a level of chaos because of the situation he's in financially, because of how precarious his situation is in Sanditon. So he always keeps his head at a level of chaos that if he packs any more on there, it's all going to come crumbling down. So he has to fight to only keep his personal concerns at the top of his list because he cannot let that fall. He cannot let it falter, or it will fully fall down and crash. And Lady D is someone who has that ability to rip everything away from Tom at the drop of a hat. If she gets angry for any reason and pulls out, Tom is basically done. And so when you walk into her house, I think they kind of played that out in the decor. Now, I don't know if that decor was already there in the house that they filmed it at or not. either way, it's brilliant because in her sitting room, it's filled with, and there's a deleted scene where they show Mary and Charlotte walking around and seeing pictures of Lady Denham and her husband and stuff like that. But when you go into the sitting room, it's stormy seas, it's ships on the stormy seas, and it's chaos. And there's this big gold statue on her. It's almost like this elevated platform, which she has this giant gold statue sitting up there. That says power. That says that I have the wealth and the status to do what I want to do, and I'm going to do it. Now with the seas, that's almost indicative of her, because she feels like she has control, and the people who are steering the ships, the boats, they feel like they have the control, but it's not them, it's the sea that has control. And so Lady Denham feels like she has all the control and she's holding all the cards, but she's truly not. And we can see that in later episodes, and we'll dig into that when that appears in the episodes. So beyond that, when we see Sydney and Charlotte again, it just intensifies the point that Sydney was instantly drawn to her, because when he walks in the ballroom, his eyes find her immediately. Then he introduces his friends to her and the other women, and he says Lady Denham, or he says Miss Denham first, and then the Miss Haywood, and then Miss Brereton. When he says Miss Haywood, his voice dips, and I don't think that's a conscious choice. I think it's a conscious choice by Theo James. I don't think it is by Sidney Parker. I think Sidney Parker was trying to withhold how he felt and how he was intrigued by her, but I don't think he could keep it in check fully. I think that if we looked at it a little closer, he also, during that whole interaction when he introduced his friends to the women, his eyes would go from his friends to Charlotte, and mostly to Charlotte. And his expression varied from confused to curious to distant. And I think that was him waging a war with his mind. It just came out on his face. As weird as that sounds. So he had a very hard time looking away from her, even during the beginning, even during the entirety of the dance. Actually, he starts off kind of pulled back, distant, reserved, staring her up and down, and then moving on to the dance, he looked at her for a good few seconds before turning away, and then when she asked him a question, he immediately looked back to her. So she had his attention, his focus when she was speaking to him. So he found it hard to look away. So at the very least, there was an instant, strong attraction to Charlotte on Sydney's part, at the very least. And I think there was more than that. I think that he saw something in her that he needed. And I think that he was shocked when Charlotte not only deduced his feelings, but asked of his feelings and his thoughts. And she was trying to understand him. And what he saw there was that there was a substance there instead of a focus on the superficial. And the superficial was incredibly common. I think how I imagine it is when she shocked him, it's like he had this wall up, okay? And then when she asked these questions and he kind of like pulled back and looked at her for a minute, and he's like, for my brother's sake, I do, yes. And you can see in the look on his face, he's almost confused. So I imagine like this wall up in his mind, and then he gets shocked and the walls fly down, and all these questions that he was keeping at bay with the wall came flooding forward to his head. And then when he put that wall back up, the questions had already made it over. And so I think he spent the rest of the night with those questions, and I think that's why he was so ready to answer or ask them of her later on. So here's this girl who is very attractive, very beautiful, and has this innocence and this joy to him, or to Sydney's gloom and doom, and he's drawn to her. And so he is probably unsure if it's feigned or real. He's probably unsure of, what's reality here. And so when it's interrupted by Georgiana, I think he's already kind of in a state of confusion. He's already in a state of thinking of who is this girl. So when Georgiana comes in and she completely disrupts that by not even really greeting him, just being very angry at him. But what we hear that makes me very, very sad about when Georgiana comes in is the murmurs in the crowd. It's shocked whispering. It's people yelling scandalous and negress, and just them being disgusted with the fact that there was a black woman here. Now, I understand, obviously, that racism and slavery were a very real, very prominent, not hidden thing at all then. I understand that. But it still makes me sad that it was. And it makes me sad that it was so common for Georgiana that she didn't even react to it. She just kept her eyes on Sydney, kept her eyes ahead, kept her focus on what she needed to be focused on, and ignored the rest. And in the background, we can see Diana, who seems very excited at the idea of Georgiana. But then right next to her is Mary, who seems very sad. She's either very sad or she's very concerned. And I think it plays even a deeper role into their characters, where we can see that Mary is vocal for the people who are marginalized. She's vocal for the people who are in need of defense. And I think she feels that instantly for Georgiana. But then we pan over to Charlotte, who is our progressive heroine, who is rightly disgusted with the murmurs of the crowd. And you can see that at first her face is interested, but then as she kind of looks around the room, her face distorts a little bit to be more like, what? And then she begins to watch their exchange. And what we see as Georgiana walks away is Sidney closing his eyes and taking a deep breath, where for a moment the guard on his face is down. And I think that's because he was so put off guard by Charlotte that's the first time that he kind of let a real emotion display on his face. And Charlotte was watching that scene intently. So I think that was her first sign that for whatever things Sidney is accused of by Georgiana, he genuinely didn't want. He didn't want her unhappiness. He didn't want her to be miserable. He truly didn't want that. He didn't want her unhappy. He didn't want to pull her from London. He didn't want to take her away from the one person who made her happy. It was about true protection for her. And he didn't particularly want to be a guardian, but it wasn't because he didn't care. It was because he didn't think he could do well at it. So I think it was genuinely that duty to do right by her, to really protect her in its true form. And on that same note, I think that Mrs. Griffiths, she doesn't always see it this way, but I think that with anybody, at that time especially, who doesn't have a lot of social status, who doesn't have a lot of social standing, when they see an opportunity to raise their status by proxy, I think it's really hard to resist that. And I think that's what Mrs. Griffiths did when Lady Denham asked him about her ward. There was this great lady of the town, as Tom calls her, who is asking her information and asking for information on the very wealthy heiress who is her boarding with her. And I think that she sort of feels high society by proxy. And I think that's one of the reasons she gives in to information that she didn't have to offer. I mean, she didn't have to offer anything about Georgiana's relationship, especially when she didn't fully understand or know about it in great detail. She didn't have to do that. But I think that she felt sort of high society by proxy. And I think there were two points to scripting that in there. I think the first one is that it shows that even the people who were supposed to care about Georgiana, who were in charge of ensuring she was cared for, making sure she was well, it was hard for them to stay loyal and true to her alone, as opposed to giving in to when other people ask about her. And I think the other aspect of that, the reason it was scripted in there, is Arthur. I think that when Arthur sees that, obviously he's not going to take advantage of her money, because that's not who he is. That's not what he wants. He has no plans to marry or be a part of her. He's content with his sister. He's content with the life that they've built. So that's not what he's doing it for. But I think that him overhearing that conversation and hearing how Mrs. Griffiths had offered that information up, on top of realizing that Georgiana was probably very upset at having lost that relationship, I think that Arthur truly sees an outcast in need of a friend. And I think that he understands the need for an altruistic friendship for Georgiana. And that's what he can offer her. Arthur doesn't want anything from her. He doesn't need anything from her. He doesn't want anything from her, and he doesn't need it. And I think that he alone has the ability, other than maybe Charlotte, to offer her a completely altruistic friendship, where all it is just, I want you to not be sad. I want you to be cared for. I want you to not suffer. And so his other goal was to lighten her load with that. And that's one thing that's one of the reasons why I love Arthur so much, is because that is his personality. That's who he is. And it has to be asked, the question has to be asked, if Arthur has a drinking problem. Because, and I don't mean to laugh at a drinking problem, but I think when we first meet him, he's complaining about how he barely got out of his bed, and he's very melodramatic when we first meet him. But they get back to the house where there's wine, right? And he's telling Charlotte about how in the morning he feels very terrible. But then he has 3 or 4 glasses of wine and he feels right as rain. And he's not bilious, because then wine wouldn't make him feel better. So I think that I wonder if the bilious there, because bilious means nauseous. It can mean something else. But I think in this instance what they're meaning is nauseous. And I'm wondering if maybe his sister was saying that maybe you are feeling nauseous or sick because you drank too much. And he's saying that, well, no, that can't be because then I couldn't drink. I don't know if that's what she's saying, but I do know that oftentimes if you're hungover, you feel terrible and groggy and horrible. And they say that the way to cure that is to drink. So he says after wine, he feels better. And then when we see them in the bathing, he says, no, I'm not going to go with you. And then he slams back some wine. Granted, it's one glass. But when he slams back some wine, he decides, you know what? I am going to go with you. And at the ball, when he's with Georgiana, before he goes out to dance with her, he slams back a glass of wine. And I think that's why Charlotte sees the over lethargic and over energetic. Because I think when he's got wine in him and he's been drinking, he's over energetic. But when he doesn't have it, he's just so, I don't think he's emotionally down, but I think that he doesn't do well without alcohol. So that is something to consider. And I love his character. I am hard pressed to find an issue with his character. So I'm not saying that he's a bad and he's alcoholic. I'm not saying that. I'm just wondering if, because clearly he doesn't drink as much as Crow. I mean, Crow is barely functioning. So I think that but I still think he might have somewhat of a drinking issue. Whether it's he just needs a little bit of every day, I think he does have a need for it. So I want to talk a little bit about Lady Denham's response to Mrs. Griffiths as well in here. When Mrs. Griffiths tells her that there was an unsuitable romance, and she says, I'm not surprised. Now, I don't know if that is because she's a black woman, but I'm inclined to believe it's because she's a young woman who is in London, who has a lot of money, and you kind of get that sense in later episodes. But I don't think it's about her being a black woman. I think that it is that she has wealth and status, and she's young, and she's a woman, and of course she's going to have an unsuitable romance. It could also be, of course, because men want her for her money, and they're going to try to get her for her money. So I think it's, we can't write off Lady Denham's motives right then as racist. I think that we can look at another aspect of it, because I think that when we see her in later episodes and how she interacts with Georgiana and how she views Georgiana, for her, what Lady Denham sees is dollar signs. And I think that that's how she sees everything, is through the lens of money more than skin color. And I'm sure it was very rare for someone of status back then to not be a racist. So I'm sure there was a little bit in there, at least as far as I've read and understand. But I do think in this instance, it was about a money thing and a woman thing and being young. So Clara, when she talks to, after Edward had that conversation with her, Clara tries to talk to Charlotte, right? I think that that's another woman in this story who is an outcast because of something outside of her control. That's Georgiana, right? She's an outcast because of something that's outside of her control. And I think the same is true for Clara. I think that to start, her life was probably filled with abuse. She was poor. She lived in a poor area. And even though it wasn't always the poor person's fault that they were poor, they were looked at as scum because they had no money. They weren't seen as something worth saving because they had no money. And that was her. So there was no protection for her. There was no safe haven. There was no police protection. And who would believe a woman who's poor? Back then, nobody would. So I do think that she is being honest about the things that happened to her. I fully can see that happening. I think where she might be a little dishonest is in her feelings about it, is in where she's at now with it. I think that it's become so commonplace for Clara that it has just become an accepted part of her lifestyle. Well, this is just my lot. This is just going to keep happening to me. So this is it. This is my life now, which is horribly, horribly sad. But I think for Clara, she has seen the need to take control of it, or it will control her. So I think that she makes these steps, especially what we see with Edward. I think she takes those steps on her own without Edward. I mean, yeah, Edward was trying to seduce her, but she seduced him. And I think for her, I think that's indicative of who she is as a character, is that she sees the need to do it first before it's done to her, because it's been done to her so many times. And I think that's why she pays such close attention to everybody's conversations, to how everybody is, because she has been trained by her circumstances to watch for ulterior motives, to watch for a way to make people a weapon or make herself a weapon against them. And so when she's talking to Charlotte, she's sort of done that. She's paid attention to Charlotte's conversation. She's paid attention to how Charlotte relays things and sees things. And she's playing to Charlotte's sympathies. And we can see that clearly when Crow comes up, and instantly right? Instantly, her behavior is different. Instantly, her feelings are different. Instantly, she has a completely different expression on her face, different tone to her voice, and different body language. And she almost looks back at Charlotte as if to say, see, we can all get through this. And it's her story is such a horribly, horribly, horribly sad one. So she's not fully a villain. She does some bad things. And she makes some bad choices. But I don't think she's a villain. I think back then women didn't have a voice. I think back then women, when they were raped or when they were pregnant out of wedlock, even if it was from a forceful encounter, it was the woman who was shamed, not the man. And so I think that she's a victim of her circumstances. And so saying that, I still do want to say that the decisions she makes are bad decisions. The things she does are bad things. However, I think she makes those decisions because she has learned that if she does not do whatever it takes to get what she needs, then she's in big trouble. So I just wanted to touch on that because I think that hers is one that we're going to focus on a little bit. She's one of the minor characters that we're going to focus on. She's not a minor character. It's hard to think of anything but Sydney and Charlotte as major characters, but she's a major character. And we're going to see her progression, and we're going to talk more about her as she goes. But I think that it's important going forward to remember that aspect of her story. So the next scene we come to is Sydney's alone on the balcony. And I think that I part of me thinks he went up there to watch Charlotte instead of being in her presence. I think that he was partly weighed down by how offended Georgiana is by him and how angry Georgiana is by him. I think he's weighed down by that. I think also he might have gone up there to watch Charlotte because she's the one bright spot in there, because everyone else wants something from him. So when he's up there, and she comes up there, he feels a freedom to dig deeper into her. And I think that's why he does it so quickly, because I think that she was on his mind as he stood up there watching her after the encounter where she spurred on his curiosity about her, his instinct to know her. And so we see that there's this freedom there. And I think he wanted to see if her substance, if it was feigned or if it was real. And for Charlotte, it was real. But I think he wanted to know for certain if it was real or not. And he really wanted to make her out. I think he really wanted to understand her. She wanted to understand him. And that could have even been why he wanted to understand her, because she wanted to understand him so much. I think he felt that they'd be similarly inclined. He was right. I don't think he was happy that he was right. I think he felt that there would just be happiness and nothing else. And his smile up there is the first time we really see Sydney smile, like in truth. So I think that he smiles that way because it's refreshing to be seen and thought of as the sensible brother rather than the reckless one. Even Esther views him as reckless. The people of the town view him as reckless. The people who know him view him as reckless, except for Tom and Mary. But they still view him, that while they may not view him as reckless, they view him as in need of rescuing and eventually as the rescuer. But even so, Mary even says, you know that Sydney Parker leaves everything to the last minute, which is a sort of reckless. And Tom kind of accuses him frequently of not doing enough, which is, sort of reckless. So to hear someone who is fighting to understand him, view him as sensible, I think that smile comes out because it's refreshing. But it's also true. Because he's not reckless. Not anymore, he's not. I think he finds it hard to view himself as anything but that because it's so in his face all the time, because he did make mistakes when he was younger. But he's not a reckless person. He's a sensible person. And I think that bleeds into what he says in the end of episode 7, which I won't give away just yet. But I think that's a running theme that Charlotte brings out in him. And so his anger at that, he's not angry at her for saying those things per se. I think that it's the fact that she says true things. The words that she uses are truth. And so he's protective because he feels like he has to be, but he knows she's right. He knows it. And you can see it in his interaction with both of his brothers. And you'll notice that it's Tom who he defends, not Arthur. And I think that's because he owes Tom a debt that he doesn't think will ever be paid. He feels that when debts are incurred from something like that, from Tom bailing him out, from saving his life, from Mr. Lamb bailing him out and saving his life, I think that Sydney feels that those are lifetime debts. And so he can't let anything bad be said about him. And so they did view it the same. They were similarly inclined, and so they saw the same thing. But Charlotte put it in a laughable context. She wasn't laughing at them. it was that she loved them so much that it was almost like an endearing thing rather than a critical thing. But all he heard was the voice in his own head saying these things. And so I think that he was defending out of duty, not because she was right, or not because she was wrong. I think he was just defending out of duty because he knew she was right. And I think that he felt that duty because of what they did for him. For sure. It's not because he disagreed. I think that the words he used were designed to hurt because, hurt people, right? And I think that that was his whole design, was he wanted to push this girl away. He wanted to push away this girl who saw too clearly and who could surmise things about him and open things in him that he was not comfortable opening up to. There was, like we said before, there was a clear danger for Sydney. Every time he's been connected with someone before and let someone else in, he's been hurt. He's been damaged. And so I think that he was almost sorry to do it. You could see that by the look on his face when he said it's not her fault. It looked like he was almost sorry to do that, sorry to push her away. And the music in there, first, can we just pause and take a moment to appreciate the awesome music in this entire series, but especially in episode 1. I love that Gaelic song. That is my favorite song of any song almost. And it's so good and it's so awesome. And I love listening to that soundtrack. If you don't have it, you can get it on Amazon Music. Just saying. It's really good. And also, on the same note, does anyone notice the dance that Edward Fox, or no, nope, I just mixed his names, Edward, also known as Jack Fox, the dance he does with after he says to Charlotte, no, of course, you're altogether too good, too kind to say anything. But then he like, he looks at her like, it's just so funny. He kind of goes, and then he does like this little arm thing, and it's so funny. And I laugh every single time he does it. He and Chris Marshall both have a scene where they dance like that, and it just makes me laugh. And I know he had a hurt ankle, but that's beside the point. I understand that. I just wanted to say that before I forget. But the music is perfectly timed. It's building and building and building and building and building as the tension and the energy is building and building and building, and then there's an abrupt stop. Because very suddenly, the reality, or what we know is reality, but what they fought to keep non-reality came crashing down. What Sydney fought to he didn't want that to be the reality, so he ended it, right? But it was reality, so it just came to an abrupt stop. And then we see that all around in the end of that episode is rejoicing. All around. Except for our heroine and our hero. Sydney and Charlotte are feeling very real pain. Both of them are. At what they've had to say to each other. For Charlotte, it's more what was said to her, and Sydney, it's what he had to say to her. And I truly feel like he felt no pleasure in saying that to her. I don't think he did. I don't think he felt pleasure in causing it, but I think he felt it was necessary to do to save himself. And I think he thought it was saving her a little bit. I think that he was protecting her too he feels like he's this worthless human being, this low life who hates himself. She can have no part of that. She's good. She's innocent. She's joyous. And I think that we're going to see a lot more of that play out as the series goes on. I know we will, because I've seen it several times. So that is a very long montage of my thoughts on episode 1. I think next time we do an episode recap, I will decide instead to not go over every little thing that has happened in the show. And I will just give my ideas of what happened. And I think that would be good. So next week, we have a very exciting week. Next week, it's our interview week, and it's our very first interview with a cast or crew member. I'm not going to tell you who it is, but I will be announcing it I haven't decided yet if I'm going to announce it Saturday or Sunday. I might keep you waiting until Sunday, but I promise you, you're going to love it. They were a delightful person to interview, and I really, really enjoyed it, and I think that you are going to be really psyched about it. I think that you're going to get a lot out of watching the interview, and it's going to be really fun, and it's going to be really great. And there's another thing I want to point out to you. If you see these pictures right here, Theo and Sydney. Nope. Theo and Rose, Charlotte, and Sydney. These are done by an amazing person I met through the Sisterhood, actually, through Sanditon Sisterhood. You go into Twitter, there's a whole world of Sanditon that you can't access anywhere else. And I met her on there, and she was drawing these things, and they were beautiful. And I had asked her if I could buy them from her, and she made 13 pieces for me. And my goal is to display a different one every week, so keep watching back there and see what I got up there. But the art is by Liana. I'm so sorry if I mispronounced your last name, but it's Liana Kalashian. And her Instagram is Liana, Liana _ fashion art. And once you're there, you can see her other Instagram account. She's a fashion designer account, and she's got a blog spot. So check her out. Seriously, she is so, so, so incredibly talented. And I am so thrilled to be able to have her artwork up there. It's so great. And I might put the link in the podcast description too, if you want to go see her. So that is our episode for this week. And I am already looking forward to next week. So I will see you guys in a week. Have a great week. Enjoy your time and look forward to our next podcast. Bye, guys.